It's time to talk about one of my favourite subjects in film and sometimes in life: revenge. It's a muddy genre morally, but it has some pretty clean-cut parameters when it comes to plot. Lead character is scorned and vows to take revenge, often in the form of death or confrontation. We watch him enact his entertaining, violent, and cathartic retribution. Think Taken, John Wick, Death Wish, or more controversial fare like Gaspar Noé's Irreversible or Park Chan-wook's Old Boy. As you've probably noticed, something these classics have in common is that they all have men at the centre. And what I want to look at today is what revenge looks like when the masculinity of the genre is removed and the femininity takes centre stage. Even without lead female characters, I find it really interesting that in many classic revenge films, the revenge is still motivated by harm done to a woman. A man's wife is killed, his daughter is kidnapped, his partner raped. It's not often that the inciting incident is physical harm done to the man, but it's his emotional response to the treatment of women around him that we're watching. He is a victim in a sense because something he loves, or dare I say owned, has been damaged or taken from him. It brings into question this idea of ownership and protecting women as if they can't protect themselves. So why could something like Taken not be the journey of the daughter breaking herself out of her predicament? Likely because a large part of the American audience still hold reasonably traditional values that see a man protecting his family as more commercially appealing. It's considered honourable in the American value system as a man to protect the women in your community. But when that's the basis of these types of stories, it's the female body that is sacrificed in order for the male character to begin his journey. And we, the audience, begin to understand women's roles in life as props in men's life. It's unintentional objectification that likely started with good intentions, but the lovely lady becomes an object, no less. So I look slightly less glamorous, because obviously before I looked incredible. There are, of course, female-led revenge films that still take the route of guns, violence, knives, like I Spit on Your Grave or one of my favourite films, Revenge. They are shocking and violent, akin to your typical revenge film. But even just seeing the victim be the one enacting the revenge makes them stand out. Rape revenge on a whole is a controversial and morally ambiguous genre. But there's no denying that the crime itself is worthy of punishment, whatever that punishment may be. 2014's Gone Girl is an intriguing twist on the trope, as the antagonist, Nick Dunn, hasn't really committed an obvious crime. Amy Dunn punishes her husband Nick because she feels he's neglected her. There are some distinct transgressions, such as Nick cheating, but that aside, he was no more than an arsehole underappreciating his wife and not brave enough to end things. Depending on how you look at it, Amy Dunn is either pure evil, putting her husband through absolute torture when she could just leave him, or she's a complete badass for not taking male iniquity lying down. This is an instance where gender plays an incredibly important role in the plot, as we have an instant understanding of who Amy and Nick are based on their established roles as husband and wife. Amy is a housewife, beautiful, delicate, and perceived as a loving partner. And she has the cunning to take advantage of this. If Nick were to be the one wanting revenge on his partner, he'd have the advantages of physical strength and wouldn't necessarily have to seek avenues of revenge beyond physical harm. Amy doesn't have the advantage of being a strong 6'3" man, so she has to come up with something that plays into her hand. In writing this character, Gillian Flynn isn't attempting to create an objective hero, but explore some of our darker desires as women as a response to subjugation, and explore this in a way relevant to a middle-class housewife, someone who is not considered reactive, violent, or short-tempered, but thoughtful and patient. This isn't a woman who's prepared to end up dead or in jail for the sake of one righteous bullet through the chest of her enemy. She wants Nick to suffer emotionally. She wants to torment him from afar, knowing the game is being played on her terms. The revenge is based on what Amy values, which is not physical strength or power, but sanity and emotional stability. Moving away from female-led revenge, I want to discuss one of my favourite releases of last year. The Western is a typical backdrop for a revenge tale, the likes of Django Unchained or True Grit, and most recently, Jane Campion's Power of the Dog, which centres around Phil, a cud-chewing cunty country cowboy, and his sister-in-law Rose and her son, Peter. Rose and Phil have an instant discomfort around each other, and in order to torment Rose, Phil decides to develop a closer relationship with Peter. Peter is an effeminate boy, first shown to us making paper flowers and crying in his mother's arms. Phil, who is partially privy to this, is cruel and critical of Peter's weak, effeminate traits. It's hard to say if Peter is coded as gay or just feminine, but either way, he does not belong in this harsh Western world. Eventually, and significant spoilers if you've not seen the film, I would highly recommend, Peter takes advantage of Phil's attempts to mentor him and teach him the ways of the ranch, and uses this developing closeness to expose Phil to anthrax, ultimately killing him. In his arrogance, Phil believed that they had developed a relationship surpassing that of Peter and his mother, but as we all know, you can't keep gay boys and their mothers apart. In poisoning Phil, Peter can finally relieve Rose, his mother, of Phil's torment. Having the final victor in a Western be a quiet femme and possibly queer boy who uses his perceived naivety against the traditional masculine lead is a liberating and exhilarating resolution. It's rare to see characters like this triumph on screen or even in the real world, which is in many ways still built for the traditional man. This raises an important discussion of good representation. Peter ultimately is a murderer. Some would argue this isn't the positive queer representation that we should be consuming, but it's a representation of queer anger, patience, and vengeance, or depending on how you look at it, feminine vengeance. As in Michaela Cole's incredible I May Destroy You, which I'll discuss more later, Power of the Dog explores territory we are Power of the Dog explores territory we are often uncomfortable with and feel guilty or ashamed of for desiring. It is a revenge fantasy on masculinity itself. And to me, that is good representation because it's honest and unashamed of its desire to see those who have held female, femme, or queer people down finally facing our wrath. By the by, if you're interested in reading more of my thoughts on this film, specifically about its nuanced representation of queerness, you can check out the Pantograph Punch review that I wrote. I've linked it in the bio. I discussed Gone Girl earlier as a twisted take on revenge conventions, but recently we've seen the emergence of several films and TV shows that have strayed even further away from our traditional understandings of revenge. They are still stories about women triumphing over men who have done them wrong, but these women come out on top in unconventional ways that may not provide the viewer with the expected catharsis. In 2020's Promising Young Woman, Cassie has become fixated on avenging the death of her best friend Nina, who was raped by a college classmate and subsequently took her own life. Amongst other things, Cassie's revenge involves making a female classmate who hadn't believed Nina at the time believe that she herself has been sexually assaulted, and pretending to kidnap the daughter of the college dean who dismissed the rape allegation. But ultimately, Cassie's revenge takes shape in the form of her own death, allowing her to finally see Nina's rapist Al behind bars. These final moments of the film, which reveal that Cassie had prepared to die, even planned it, divided audiences on what this said about female suffering. Some people vehemently expressing they felt it was an insulting ending and only further harmed women by implying that they can't win without immense suffering, or perhaps at all. Another film I've thought about a lot in its presentation of revenge is Jennifer Kent's The Nightingale. To cut a long story short, in 1800s Australia, a woman named Claire is raped and her husband and baby murdered by Hawkins, the lieutenant overseeing the colonial force they have travelled to Australia with. She tracks him down with the help of Billy, an Aboriginal tracker who has suffered at the hands of the colonisers, and finally confronts him. But rather than kill or injure Hawkins, she recounts his crimes in a room filled with his fellows and superiors, and then leaves. Her revenge is simply to expose him, despite the grotesqueness of the crimes he committed against her and her family. I May Destroy You, a comedy drama from the incredible Michaela Cole, also explores the aftermath of rape when Arabella was drugged and taken advantage of on a night out. For anyone who has experienced similar trauma, it is a crushing exploration of guilt, regret, empowerment, delusion, and revenge that probably more so than anything before it captures the emotional aftermath of sexual assault. In the final episode, Arabella churns through a series of fantasy scenarios that include her drugging, beating, and killing her rapist, sleeping with him consensually, and comforting him for assaulting her. But in reality, it seems Arabella has done nothing. No real revenge in the way that we would expect, no confrontation, as her assailant was a stranger she would never be able to track down. Which also means, in some ways, no closure. But sometimes fantasies are all we get. They are our acts of revenge, as tangible revenge is rarely an option. If you can't have the catharsis of beating the ever-living shit out of someone who took your peace and your joy and your sense of security, at least you can imagine it. She wants to hurt him, she wants to forgive him, she wants him to feel guilty. She wants to imagine that he was sweet. It's not the story of a woman wanting to directly avenge some wrongdoing. It's an examination of the way assault can shatter your certainty of who you are and what you want. In all three of these stories, we're forced to confront the complexity of revenge and wrestle with the fact that it doesn't always look the way that we want it to. Sometimes the victim stays a victim. Often revenge can never bring back what we've lost, and most of the time we don't even know what it is we want or need to heal. Now, I've been advised by my lawyers and my mother to omit this section, but I think it's important to say that one of the reasons I love these stories is because I share that desire for vengeance. It's a normal part of life to want revenge on the people who've hurt us, whether you've been bullied, abused, excluded, but significantly at times in my own life where I've wanted to see the comeuppance of people that have hurt me. In reality, I've done nothing to make it happen. And that's partially because I don't want to seem crazy, and partially because of genuine empathy I have towards the people who've hurt me and my own discomfort in feeling hatred towards them. This is the reason why I love these various explorations of female or feminine rage that we've looked at. When someone has hurt me, I flip-flop constantly in my response to them and can rarely commit to a singular feeling. A desire for revenge is not a clear-cut path, and I think a lot of us reject that desire because it's painful and because we want to be above that way of thinking. Men have been able to express their desire for revenge for years and years on screen, and it's been seen as admirable and moral, highlighting their protectiveness and masculinity. But it's vulnerable of femme filmmakers to express these desires when they might be perceived as petty, psychotic, or evil. It's a relief to see those cruel, outlandish, and stereotypically crazy ideas realised on screen because, as embarrassing as it is to admit, they're often relatable. It doesn't mean you, in enjoying these stories, are solidifying yourself as a vengeful person. You're just allowing yourself to explore one avenue in an incredibly complex map of hurt. So as we've discussed, revenge served by one more feminine doesn't always look the same as the revenge we've come to expect. Gun-toting bald men on the hunt for the killers of their wives, or inexplicable martial arts abilities materializing when someone double-crosses a middle-aged white guy in America. But women, queer people, feminine people, people who cannot rely on masculinity or physical strength, have different intentions for their revenge. Not always to kill or maim or even confront, and therefore different methods and different outcomes. Some unsatisfactory because they still require female suffering or exist only as a fantasy, and some deliciously satisfying as we finally see someone soft, femme or queer coming out on top. But both are equally as important to see on our screens as they allow us to experience the full spectrum of feminine vengeance.